the back here as well. The bar will be open after the event as well if you want to hang around and get another drink. And we'll do a little book signing inside with Pamela after the event wraps up, and there'll be books available. This evening, the books are $24.99 each, or if you get two, it'll be two for $40. So my last job is just to introduce our two lovely ladies here this evening. So Pamela Asai is a Brisbane-based visual artist and poet, and this is her second book. And we have Dr. Bronwen Levy joining us this evening. She's a specialist in recent writing. For many years, she taught literature and women's studies at the University of Queensland, where she is now honorary senior research fellow. So let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you very much. And I would also like to continue your acknowledgement of the Turrbal Yagra peoples, who of course were the very first poets speaking poetry on these lands. Is it?
It is on.
Is it on?
Yes, yeah, you're right.
Good. So it's always good at the microphone.
It does sound a little bit low.
Yeah, do you want to have a bit of a look at it?
Yeah, I checked it just before, but feel free if you want to use the other one. That might, if it's a little bit closer.
Well, it's really what works for everybody. Is that more better?
Oh, do you want to check?
Or maybe it should come up.
I'm just,
It
I'm
probably
a
should come up.
music
high.
person. It's sometimes that the
Thanks.
certain mics have a very, very close field.
Yeah,
So I think the closer we get,
the better.
do not be afraid of that microphone.
Same. Oh yeah, that sounds better.
It actually fits in with the first poem of Pans I intend to read, and I'll tell you why when we get up to that metaphorically. Okay, well this is of course, for starters, a very happy occasion. So congratulations to Pam. This is her second book of haiku-inspired poetry. First one was called Ash. It came out in 2017. A number of you may have seen that one already. And this one is called Uneven Verse, and it's more or less hot off the press. But Pam is known as an artist more widely than as a poet, although she's well known as a poet. But she's also a painter, as many of you would know. I think there's a way that we can think about Pam's artwork and her poetry as coming from a similar space, although taking a different direction, doing things that can be compared in art and in words. Now, I'm not going to say too much about her painting, of course, because we don't have examples of that here. But if you don't know her work, she does have a website, pamelaasai.com.au, where there's lots of poetry, but also lots of artwork and painting that you can look up. The connection is the imagistic direction of Pam's creative work. I'm not going to say output, because I think that's a hideous term to describe literature or art. Her creative work, so far as I know it, is all broadly imagistic. The abstract paintings, which are very beautiful, some of them you can recognise the objects, some of them are designs that perhaps connect to things in the real world, abstract representations of them, and the poems, which are imagistic as well. So like her first book, this one, Uneven Verse, is organised around the seasons. We move from summer through all the seasons until the next summer. And there's a similar cyclical seasonal structure in her first book as well. But it's a different set of seasons, a different set of years, a different set of things going on. In the first book, there's a side trip to Japan. But as everyone here is aware, it's been difficult to take side trips a long way away recently. So the side trip in this book is to the Darling Downs instead. But that does provide for quite an interesting contrast. The landscape, the weather in particular, is much drier compared to the landscape and natural world, but also the built world, the city, the inner city of Brisbane, where the speaker poet, who's perhaps rather like Pam, moves through the seasons, moving around, looking at things, thinking about them, and the poems represent different things, different objects, different ideas that she comes across during that cyclical period. So mostly we're in Brisbane and environs, especially the inner city, a little bit of bribey, a little bit of tambourine, and the side trip to the Darling Downs. Even though this book is closer to home in terms of its travelling, there's no sense of restriction because of Pam's method. Pam, as a writer, as an artist, focuses in. She becomes absorbed in what she's looking at and thinking about and writing about. So any sense of boundaries around the edges disappear. Instead, in a very meditative way, we focus on the moment. Sometimes these moments are ephemeral, they change. I would like to suggest to you that they are always, however, elegantly expressed, and often elegant topics as well, although not always. There's quite a lot of variety in these poems. So Pam writes about moments in experience. Her art, as I understand it anyway, is imagistic and it's haiku-inspired, not exactly the same as a haiku. She might talk about this later, but you can follow that idea up on her website as well. And it's very reflective. She brings us a moment in time. And because this book has a whole series of moments of time arranged according to the seasons, even though there isn't a narrative, the poems are images. They don't tell stories, they're images. Because there's a whole series of images or poems, we get a sense of moving through something with her. It's not exactly the same as a story with a middle, a beginning, and an end, because we go from summer to summer, so at the end we're back at the beginning again. But there is a sense of movement, of continuity, of flow. So for no particular reason, I'm going to start with this poem, which in a metaphorical way may link to the microphone. That is, if you're scared of microphones. I'm not particularly, but some people are. So the poem I'm going to read comes from the spring section of the book. I'll give you the number in case you want to look it up later, but I think the numbers aren't intrinsic to the poems. It's just, giving you a numbering going through it. So it's number 196. It's about a python. So that might be the imagistic connection. However, the python in here is much more elegant than any old microphone might be. So I'll just read you this poem. And it's spring. This is the first poem in the spring sequence. The elegant python in the warm spring sunshine looking for breakfast. The elegant python in the warm spring sunshine looking for breakfast. This is quite a surprising poem. We find ourselves at the beginning of spring coming across a python who is on the move looking for breakfast. We don't know if the python is successful in getting her or his breakfast, although probably being a python and the seasons will continue and so on and so on. Probably there is success, but we don't actually see that. What the speaker, the poet, the poem here is interested in is the python's action of looking for breakfast, which is continuous. It's not looks for breakfast, it's looking. It continues. And perhaps that continuation, when we think about the elegant python, which is maybe slithering along or maybe curled, but we can think about the pattern on the skin, that the connection there might be that movement, that unfurling, that slithering of the python, the elegant python, which is moving, even though the poem captures it in a single moment. So the movement, the shape and form of this poem and of the python interests me, and its elegance. It's an unusual word to apply to a python, although it's very apt when you think about it. The poem makes us think about that. And also, pythons aren't as bothersome to humans as some other kinds of snakes are, or usually they're not anyway. But it's nevertheless a word that defuses any fear, and we understand the python just to be going about its business, trying to get its breakfast. But snakes are powerful images. in all sorts of imaginaries of knowledge, of creativity, of change, because they get rid of one skin and another one the next year and all that kind of thing. So it's quite a mysterious image, I think, quite a mysterious poem to start the spring sequence with. And in the way that it's written, I think what Pam, I'll stop saying Pam, the speaker, all of this. I'll say Pam, although Pam, the writer of the poems, mightn't be exactly the same as Pam, the person. I just feel a bit awkward sitting here saying speaker and this kind of thing when Pam's sitting right here next to me. So if that's okay with everyone, I hope it's all right with Pam. Okay, Pam tries to strip away anything extraneous in this writing. We just have a few words that give us quite an incredible image in this minimalist way. Now, in this book, Pam and us, we, her friends, her readers, are moving with her. Perhaps we're walking, sometimes we're sitting still, sometimes we're inside looking out a window, sometimes we're doing something inside, but often we're outside. And while I think you could read this book and you don't really have to know exactly where it is anywhere. You can work out it's a subtropical city and so on, and that will mean something to you. But if you do know the inner suburbs of Brisbane, and if you know the New Farm area or the river area more generally of Brisbane, there'll be things that you recognise, things that you've seen yourself on your travels. So we stop and we observe small things. Plants, flowers, the sky, the moon, the river, birds and animals. Sometimes there's people, sometimes there's cooking going on if we're inside. There's a lot of sight, a lot of looking at things, a lot of colours. There's a lot of sound, a lot of movement, bird call and all kinds of noises that you just hear as you go around. There's a lot of smell. There's flowers, for example, and there's also food. So it's quite a sensuous experience that's given to us in this very spare writing, which I think is quite an interesting feature of the work as well. We're treated to intense observations, stopping to focus on each one, even though each image or observation is also ephemeral. Here now, gone next time. The python mightn't be there in 5 minutes' time, might have slithered off somewhere else, looking still for its breakfast. So it might be something like that, the here now, gone tomorrow element. Or it might be that there's a change due to changing seasons or changing perspectives. Sometimes we come back to somewhere we've been before, but it's never exactly the same. When you return to something, it's never exactly the same as it was before. We're getting, I think, a meditative, a philosophical, and also an artist's view, of course, in all of this. We're always close to home, that is the home of the writer, Pam's home, but we're moving around in it. It's quite a fluid, open experience. So just to give you a little idea of some of the things that you might come across in the spring sequence of the book, after the python, and the python is getting going, the python's moving in that first poem in the spring sequence. We come across several animals. We come across cats, different cats. We come across flowers because it's spring, orange blossom and jasmine. There's also jacaranda, all the things we're familiar with in spring here. There's a moon. Sometimes it's nighttime, it's not always day. There's a dry, warm wind. There's a shiny black crow. There's a young man who's sweeping large brown seeds, probably off a pavement, or the poem doesn't say so exactly, or maybe he's sweeping them up off the grass, I don't know, but he's busy. And the speaker poet Pam notices all of these in her perambulations. And one of the things it seems to do, if we look at the sequencing of the poems, and maybe this isn't how it's intended, but we tend to make links between poems when we read them in the sequence, even though, as I've said, it's not a narrative as such, is that the poet starts to think of art more abstractly. She makes art from her observations of all of these things that she's observing, but she also starts to think of art more abstractly. So what I'd like to do now is read you some poems, also in this spring sequence, but which start to refer to writing or art more specifically. And we've already had, as I've mentioned, a bit of this pythons and cats and moons and church bells and, you know, all kinds of things. So we've, as readers, where we've been asked or enticed into the meditative space of a poet who starts to think about writing. So this is a sequence of poems from number 209, if you do want to look them up later on. So this is 209. On the rim of my thoughts, poetry teeters. On the rim of my thoughts. So rim, that's like some kind of container. The next one, 210. Words like potter's clay to mould. So we move from that rim to potter's clay. So we're thinking of perhaps a lovely ceramic object. Perhaps that might be how that image works, although it could also work in other ways. We tend to think of glasses or cups or something ceramic, and there's a rim. On the rim of my thoughts, at the edge, poetry teeters. The next one, 210, words like potter's clay to mould. By this point, the speaker Pam is much more engaged with actually doing something. The poems are then on the rim, teetering, beckoning perhaps, and now she's thinking about working with them. 211, she looks up. Through a stormy sky, starlings swooping and turning after rain. The next one, 212, she looks down. In the hard concrete, a line of cat prints. Cat poetry. 213, art, a record of presence. That's all. I like the progression here after all of the various images that I've been talking about of spring or found in spring. We move to poetry on the rim, teetering, then words to mould like potter's clay, and then return to looking up, starling, swooping and turning, which is quite artistic if you think about the movement across the sky, and then down the dear little cat prints in the concrete, because a cat ran across the concrete when it was still wet cement. Cat poetry. Every time you see little cat prints or maybe dog prints in concrete from now on, I want you to think, well, birds, dog poetry, bird poetry, cat poetry. That idea comes from here. I bet none of you have ever thought of it before, have you? No, you haven't. There you go. That's something you can do tomorrow when you're walking around. You can look for cat poetry. But then our poet steps back a bit and says, art, a record of presence. That's all. That's all. I think we might reflect a little on the that's all, because that's all sound like, in some ways, as though it's not very much, but actually it's quite a lot, because all actually is enough. All is everything. All is everything that we require. So it's philosophical here, as well as a statement about art. Art's a record. The question then becomes, what kind of record? What's being recorded? And then there's the question of the achievement of art. How does it get to be recorded? And that's when we start looking at how the poems are put together. So in this record, if we then move back a little bit and think about the whole book, Uneven Verse, as a record of a year, you know, set in the places I've been talking to you about, that's all, but also that's everything. I think that's quite a profound and quite interesting little statement there, observation about poetry. So there's lots of poems in this book that I like, and I'm sure you'll have the same experience as me when you read it. Everyone will have their favourites. In summer, I'll move to some of the summer ones now. There's a fun poem, really, although of course it's much more than that, about rain. This is summer. So this seems straightforward, but I'm not sure that it is really. Number 13. Rain coming, washing in, plants out. I'm familiar with that. Rain coming, washing in, plants out. So the writer of the poem is kind of buzzing around a bit, kind of gathering things in or out because of the rain. It's a very economical poem. And again, there's this elegance. Remember that elegant python who perhaps for my talk about this, maybe, you know, there's different ways of looking at it, but if the python can be my symbol for tonight, then the python becomes perhaps a kind of a symbol of poetry itself. And that's a very elegant little poem, like the python is elegant. So lots of simple elegance and economy in the imagery. And often too, quite interesting allusions, maybe to other artworks, maybe to song, maybe to things, you know, various other things extraneous that many of us would know about. There's a couple of allusions to Bribey Island, which refer to the artist Ian Fairweather, who of course famously lived there as a kind of virtual hermit and made amazing paintings, which are Asian influenced, like the haiku-influenced poetry here is Japanese influenced. Okay, so there's one, it's poem 26, again, we're in summer 1, the first summer in the sequence. On Fairweather's Island, in the shadow of glass houses, water laps the shore. Bribey Island. And can't you see it? On Fairweather's Island, in the shadow of glass houses, water laps the shore. I think we see both Bribey Island as we understand it, but we also have an image in our minds of Fairweather's paintings of Bribey Island. A little later, there's another allusion. It's another poem which gives a different version of much the same bit of scenery, much the same place, poem 42. From Fairweather's Island, the mountains of China out of still waters rise. From Fairweather's Island, the mountains of China out of still waters rise. It's a bit further along. So just two slightly different directions of looking at the water of Bribey Island and the Glasshouse Mountains, the reference to Ian Fairweather, just emphasised differently, but it's the same or similar view. So some of the allusions, in fact, flow on from each other or recur. They mightn't necessarily flow, they just recur and connect via the imagery throughout the book. Again, in the Summer 1 section, poem 48, we have a little poem which I really like. I won't read the whole thing to you, but we have doves in it, which are saying cooperoo, cooperoo. That's a wonderful in-joke for people who live in Brisbane, and for people who don't, there's wonderful Google, and of course we can find out that the Turrbal and Jagera people, the first poets, thought that was what the doves say, cooperoo. So again, I challenge you, like the cat poetry, if you ever hear a dove again, I bet you'll think cooperoo, not coo, in the less adequate European way of saying it. And the doves are also calling in other poems, number 166, I think a bit later on, although the word cooperoo isn't repeated, but you've read it earlier. So by the time you get up to the second, well, it may not be the second, but into another poem that features doves, you'll remember cooperoo from earlier. So it all starts working in your mind. Now there's one poem, there's many poems that I like in here, but there's another one that I want to read. It's a little bit different from some of the ones I've read already. It features a machine. So that's why I thought I'd show you that Pam, has a great range of things that she talks about. There's a machine in this. Sorry, I'm confusing poem and page numbers here. I'll just find it. It's number 60. Where are we? Here we are. Yes, so this is poem 60, still in the first summer section. The machine is a machine we're all familiar with. We're used to thinking of it like that because we're so used to it. 2 cattle dogs running beside a bicycle in the rain at night. So there you are, out in some street around here. There's someone riding this bike, but the rider of the bike isn't mentioned. Instead, it's the cattle dogs, which of course is what you notice. 2 cattle dogs running beside a bicycle in the rain at night. And that's a wonderful vignette of an image that, because we all see that kind of thing going on all the time. It contrasts nicely with the python. I think it's a very different version of an animal. These cattle dogs are connected to an owner who we don't actually see, and are they passing the bicycle by, or is the owner going for, you know, those people who go, maybe you do, who go riding their bikes and have their dogs kind of on leashes. I don't know, that's how I see that, but it may not be. Maybe the cattle dogs just happen to be happily walking around in the street the way they used to. Remember when I was a child, dogs used to go walking. I mean, the problem with this was that sometimes dogs bit you, but they did go walking by themselves to meet their friends. You know, so maybe these dogs are free like that, or maybe they're with their kind owner. We hope the owner's kind. It's a bike rider. I don't know the answer to that. You can imagine what you want to think about that. Anyway, by this point, I'm in danger of reading you the whole book, so I'm going to stop. I know Pam wants to read some of the poems to you, and you'd probably like to discover some of them for yourself as well. So I'll stop mid-poem, as it were, or mid-sequence anyway, or mid-book, and declare that the book Uneven Verse to be launched and to be open. So congratulations. And I'll hand over to Pam now, because she has a few words to say to you as well. After that, there'll be a question and answer session.
Thank you, Bronwen. That was very complimentary and very insightful. I learned something as well. And it was a lovely overview covering the range of poetry in this volume. So as a contrast, I'm going to focus on just 2 poems and 2 essential elements of haiku that they illustrate. Now, Bronwen mentioned my website, and I've just started a blog, and in that my first blog is called The Haiku Form. So this, it's more of a thorough investigation of all the different elements of the haiku form as I see it. And in this talk, I'm just going to focus on 2 of those and just expand on those a little bit more in a way that isn't done in the blog. So the first element is the simplicity of language, and the second is suggestibility. And I think that Bronwen has introduced both of those really well, because the simplicity of language, she talks about that, has talked about that a lot. But suggestibility is the way she reads into the poetry, the way she brings herself to the poetry and brings her understanding to a very simple 3-line poem. But she's the way she thinks about that is really the way that haiku needs to be read. So that's suggestibility, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. So the first one, simplicity of language. The American poet and translator of Buddhist literature, Lucian Strike, 1924 to 2013, wrote of the haiku, the poet presents an observation of a natural or often commonplace event in plainest diction without...
Sorry, I think that mic's feeding back a little bit.
Okay, stand away.
We're just going to work it out. I just don't want to have your beautiful words
Yes,
feeding back
skewered.
because they shouldn't be. So.
Well, it's a different person, so maybe I'm speaking more closely than Bronwen.
Yeah, so let's just try. Megan, can you give some feedback from the back?
Okay. I'll just read that quote. The poet presents an observation of a natural, often commonplace event in plainest diction, without verbal trickery. The effect is one of sparseness, yet the reader is aware of a microcosm related to transcendent unity. A moment crystallized, distilled, snatched from time's flow, and that is enough. I always get emotional when I give speeches. Uneven verse is dedicated to my first grandson, Ari, and he's here today. Yes, Mother. He's nearly 6 now, but this poem was written after I held him for the first time when he was 4 days old. And it's in the beginning, there's a dedication for Ari, and then there's his poem, which hangs in his room. And this is the poem, Haiku for Ari. The light of a round moon falls on a distant sea. New to the world, you sleep and dream. Imagine sitting with a tiny newborn baby in your arms, called Ari, looking out over the mountains as you're sitting in the cabin up at Mount Glorious, looking towards the sea in the distance, where a silvery moon reflects on the water. The moon is round and smooth. The baby's head is round and smooth too. The baby and the moon, the new and the ancient, the mortal and the eternal, the beauty and wonder of both. The baby sleeps and dreams at peace in the universe, just as the moon is also at peace. And I am looking down on the baby, just as the moon is looking down on us all. It is, as Strike says, a microcosm related to transcendent unity, a moment crystallized, distilled, snatched from time's flow. So that's the first element of haiku, simplicity of language and what it can contain. The second element that is essential to the haiku form is suggestibility. And Bronwen gave us some wonderful examples of how that works. To come alive fully, haiku needs the reader's participation. Perhaps because haiku is so brief and the language is so plain, it does not explain everything or give you all the answers or meanings. It's up to you, the sensitive reader, to bring yourself to the reading. Strike says in another quote, without a sensitive audience, it would appear unimpressive. One dimension of suggestibility is poets referring to other poets or writers. Bronwen mentioned that I bring in references to artists, and so if you know Fairweather, then you know the work, you know his connection to China, and that will feed into your appreciation of that particular poem. But there's a wide range of poetry there, and if you don't know Fairweather, then you're not going to miss much. I'm not a Buddhist, but I'm interested in Zen Buddhism and in the Tao. And it is this interest that started me on the path of writing haiku in the first place. If this is also an interest of yours, you will notice references to ideas from the Zen tradition within the poetry. So I'd like to talk about one of these poems. Number 65. In a world of utility, I live for all that is useless. This is a reference to a quote by Zhang Zui, the Taoist philosopher who lived somewhere between 369 and 286 BC. This is the quote. Everyone knows the usefulness of what is useful, but few know the usefulness of what is useless. Have you heard this before? No. It's a great quote. What is the usefulness of what is useless? Is this about art? Is this about the value of art? The purpose of art? That's what I wondered at first. And the answer is a typical Taoist one, maybe. Yes and no. No dichotomies. Zhang Zui goes on to tell the story of a huge tree. So let me tell you part of the story. Carpenter Shri was travelling in the countryside when he came upon the tree of the shrine at the Kuyan Bend. It was over 100 arm spans round, so large that thousands of oxen could shade themselves beneath it. It was surrounded by marvelling sightseers, but the carpenter walked past it without a second look. When his apprentice finally got tired of admiring it, he caught up with the carpenter and said, Since taking up my axe to follow you, master, I've never seen a tree of such fine material as this, and yet you don't even deign to look twice at it or pause beneath it. Why? Carpenter She said, stop, say no more. This is worthless lumber. As a ship, it would soon sink. As a coffin, it would soon rot. As a tool, it would soon break. As a door, it would soon leak sap. As a pillar, it would bring infestation. This is a talentless, worthless tree. It is precisely because it is so useless that it has lived so long. Back home, the tree came to the carpenter in a dream. It said to him, what do you want to compare me to? One of those cultivated trees? When their fruit is ripe, they get plucked, and that is an insult. Their large branches are bent, their small branches are pruned. Thus do their abilities embitter their lives. That is why they die young, failing to fully live out their natural lifespans. They batter themselves with the vulgar conventions of the world, and all other creatures do the same. As for me, I've been working on being useless for a long time. It's almost killed me, but I've finally managed it, and it is of great use to me. If I were useful, do you think I would have grown to be so great? It's funny, this paradox. It was meant to be funny then, like in the BC time, and it's still funny now. I've become so great because I'm useless to the world, and it's something the tree has had to cultivate. I've been working on being useless for a long time. It's almost killed me, but I finally managed it. He's made a great effort at doing nothing. But what is the writer saying? Is he advocating laziness and selfishness? Is he saying that we should sit around cultivating our uselessness so that we can become, unlike the cultivated trees, truly ourselves and live long lives undisturbed by the strictures of social expectations? Even if this were possible, this is not the moral of the story. Sangsui develops the cultivation of uselessness with two key ideas: Wu Wei, or actionless action, or action without intention, or action without a gaining idea, and Ziran, the Taoist principle of naturalness or spontaneity. Together, they encourage us to let things be, to allow things to be just as they are, and to value all creation for what it is in itself, not for how useful it can be. And by the same token, not to internalize the social expectations to be useful to such an extent that we don't leave any room for ourselves to be anything other than useful. Just like the cultivated trees who, quote, batter themselves with the vulgar conventions of the world. Do you batter yourself? How many roles do you play? How many hats do you wear? How many ways are you useful? As employee, employer, parent, adult child parent, sibling, husband, wife, partner, colleague, friend, citizen, even as a consumer. Can you count them all? Are you ever nothing? Doing nothing for anyone? Being no one for anyone else? When are you no one? When are you not doing your duty, performing a role, no matter how rewarding or important it is? When are you ever just nothing? When are you ever useless? Could you allow yourself to be this, even for a moment? And why would you? Uneven verse doesn't advocate a life change. I'm not saying we shouldn't be useful, this is important and fulfilling. But amongst it all, can you make time not to escape from your life, but to enter into a self without identity, without definition in relation to others, a self of actionless action, of purposeless purpose, moments when you are quiet, standing at the kitchen sink, standing in the shower, lying in bed for a few minutes before you get up in the morning, looking at the sky as you hang out the washing, looking out the bus window as you come and go from work. As in this poem, number 152, I was on the bus in winter, at night, coming home from work, city lights, Chinese girls chattering, Flame trees on the bus driver's radio, all one. Let the mind wander. Let yourself float away for a while. Don't be afraid. You won't disappear because you're not being useful every second of the day. Give yourself a break. Poem 318. Will you rush to finish, or can your important life spare you for now? All the poems in Uneven Verse ask you to be present in the moment, to empty your mind of duties and roles and selves. I'm not saying be yourself, that's not it. Just be no one. Just be here, now, alive to the moment, alive to the world around you, alive to the sensations of being alive, to the joy of having a body. These poems are an affirmation of life. Like a baby. Thank you.
Right, that was beautiful. Thank you. That was very beautiful. And I think the idea of poetry as an entry into something, not an escape, is also worth remembering, given some of the terrible things that are said about poetry out there in the useful world. It's not an escape, not at all. All right, well, we'll have some time for discussion, questions, if you have questions for Pam. I've got a couple of questions to start things off if you like, but does anyone have a question formed already they'd like to ask? Yes, okay.
I really liked your analysis of haiku, and I'm just remembering back to when I was in primary school, when we taught it's got to have 5 syllables. So that's much less important, would you say?
Yes, I have to repeat the question for the Zoom, so I'll just briefly summarise what you said.
It's much less important.
Yeah,
than
it's a
any
good
other
question.
aspect.
Yes, the questions about what we learnt in primary school about haiku and the number of syllables and so on, and that seems to be less important in Pam's poetry. Do you need a
Yes.
to speak?
Oh, yes, all right. If you look at my blog, there's 5 essential elements of haiku and how they relate to my poetry. And the first one is the 5-7-5 structure. It's a great discipline, and a lot of my poems conform to the 5-7. But for people who are not aware, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. So the 3-line structure with a 5-7-5 pattern. It's a great discipline. I do a lot of counting when I'm writing, I'm always counting. And if things get a bit wordy, and in the editing phase particularly, I can pull back to that 5-7-5 or even less. The few things that are, there's a few problems with the 5-7-5. One is that even Matsuo Basho, who was the classic writer, he didn't always follow the 5-7-5 pattern. There's a lot of free haiku these days, and a lot of modern haiku poets who are writing in Japanese don't use it and don't conform to it. But the other problem is when we're writing in English, because it's a 5-7-5 pattern of syllables. Now, the syllable in Japanese is not the same as the syllable in English. And a lot of translators of Japanese haiku have actually said that when you translate a Japanese haiku into English, 4 lines and a different syllable pattern actually is a better translation of that complete poem. So you've got these issues, the Japanese don't tend to, even the masters didn't conform strictly to it. Modern Japanese free haiku doesn't conform to it. When you then transfer it into English, it's a whole nother problem. So I use it as a discipline, as a way of refining the work, but it's not something that I feel that I need to be constrained by. I'm not going to squeeze something that will come naturally in another form into to that. I think there are other elements like simplistic language and suggestibility that are more essential, I suppose, to that. But it's a good question, and I do think about it a lot.
Anyone got another question to think of? Yes,
I've got a
Sarah, you're
question
doing well.
sort
Yes,
of
yes.
tied into this the whole time both of you were speaking, I was going through this little thing in my mind about my own failed attempts to write songs and things like that. Pam, do you find that excuse me, the microphone. You use it.
Oh, I can use it. I can use this. Yeah. There's another one.
Do you find that if you were to look at your Python poem, for example, if you looked at that this month and 2 months ago and 4 months ago, would you just have this running record of words you left out? Or would that, so the same way that we have to subjectify it, do you sit there going, God, I really wanted to get tenuous in that poem, whatever, or do you literally look at it and just kind of get a feeling and then not worry about the 12 words you need?
So we've got another question about the writing of poetry, and it's about the words that weren't used. One was chosen, but perhaps there were all these other ones floating around that were discarded. And later, when the poem's been finished, does Pam think, oh, damn, why didn't I use that word instead or as well?
Keep remembering the same word.
Actually, Paul, I think this is a question about the internal critic. And there's a poem in here about the internal critic, and it would take me 10 minutes to find it. As a painter and as a writer, the internal critic is your best friend and your worst enemy. And at some point, you have to put him to bed. You've just got to leave what you've done. You've just got to leave it. You can't just keep fiddling and fiddling forever. And if the voice of the eternal critic is too loud, you end up doing nothing. You've got to
becoming useless.
Well, not a bad thing after all. But no, you can't. And if you don't put it all in that poem, then you can put it in the next one. There's always another one to. But you just have to. The thing is, my poetry is very sort of moment. It's the moment. So I don't regret. Once that little nut is closed, once it's done, that's that moment. If I go back and fiddle with it, then that's the fiddling moment. That's that moment. That's not this moment. It's got to remain as it was, or it becomes kind of corrupted. It becomes nothing. It becomes, trying to do everything, it ends up being nothing.
Yeah.
You've just got to get that bit, you've just got to get that little, and if by refining it and rewriting, I can somehow grasp that moment more specifically, more clearly, then great. But that's not about adding the words that you regret you didn't use, because you can use that somewhere. Lots of poems in the future that can be the home for that little word that you wish you used. You can always do the one word haiku if you've got a really special word that you really like. You just do the one word haiku. And I'd like you to know that it confused my editor no end, but I did a no word haiku in this one. I could have a whole book of those, couldn't I? I realised you can only do it once. I only do the no word haiku once. I can't repeat it next time.
Is that entitled The Haiku of Long-Term Relationships or something?
No title, not even a title. No, there's nothing, just a number. No word haiku. You can put a special word. I think I've got a one word haiku here somewhere, but I can't remember what it was. But I always like to include one in it.
I love the fact that you can you remember the word.
but a friend of mine who's a poet, he's got a favourite one word haiku, tundra. Tundra. Yeah, I don't think he wrote it. He just told me about it. He said that's the one. That's how I heard about the one word haiku, because he told me about tundra. I thought that's a great word. Bronwen, did you want to maybe?
Yeah, I did have a question, but I want to make sure no one else wants to ask one first. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Well, we do have one question from the Zoom.
Oh, from the Zoom.
It's from
Okay, what's the
Terry.
Zoom question?
And it's quite a broad one. How long does it take you to usually write a poem?
Oh,
Will that be recorded? Do I have to repeat?
Oh no, that should be. Hopefully, it'll pick it up.
Right, okay.
tell you a funny story. We're actually in Japan in February 2020. That's the last time we've been there. We just got our little trip in before everything shut down. And I write a lot in Japan. I think it might be partly because I can't understand the language and I'm just kind of in this kind of lovely world of emptiness, you know, it's wonderful. So we're up in the mountains of Akita and it was snowing and we're at the onsen, at the hot spring, and can't take paper and pencil into the onsen because it gets really wet. Even in the sort of bathing area, you know, when you're just washing, there's water everywhere, everything's wet. So I had my paper and my pen outside in the change room and I'd be sitting there usually soaking, and sometimes I'd be outside in the snow in the hot spring lines, just divine, sitting there, you know, looking at the snow in the night and snow coming down, and it was hot water and steam was everywhere and my brain was just racing. So I think of a poem. Of course, you don't write down straight away, you're going to forget because another poem's going to come. And then, so I'd ran outside to the area where the change room was, and I'd scribble down a little poem and then I'd put it away and I'd go back. Well, another couple of seconds, I'd be out there again. And I don't know what those ladies in the bathhouse were thinking. What is she doing? And I was back and forth and back and forth. I was getting cold, you know. And yeah, because it was just like, I remember when I wrote Ash, I went to Japan for 3 weeks. I wrote 70 poems in 3 weeks. So, I mean, that's how long does it take to rewrite a lot of poems? Well, it depends on where I am and the sort of mental state. But in each poem, if I can, you know, just writing something at home, I tend to complete the composition in my head. I sort of do my counting. I think about the thing. It's quick. It's really fast. It just has to be, a poem that you can hold in your mind. I remember I wrote one with Ari in the car and I couldn't write it down. So I couldn't write another one straight away. I had to just keep that, and I told Ari about it. And I said, I've got to remember this before we stop the car at home, because we're in the traffic and we're going through the Ivory Street tunnel and there were like crows or birds or something on the lights, and I can't remember how the poem goes now, but I kind of thought of it. I was driving and it all came together as a little complete thing, and I couldn't think of anything else. I just had to keep, I've got a terrible memory, I just had to keep that repeating and telling it to Ari, and then when we got home we stopped the car, I could get a piece of paper and write it down. So it just has to be enough, yeah, not long, it's fast.
Yes,
In relation to that, have you ever lost one?
Oh yes, terrible. Oh, my masterpieces have been forgotten. Oh, she said, have I ever lost a poem? I've lost plenty. I've learned. I keep paper and pen with me all the time. You know, I should start sort of write it on my phone or something. But no, well, I have to have a pen. I have to have a pen. And it's the
dictaphone watch.
yeah, I could do that. Yeah. The worst thing is, you know, you're lying in bed and you think of it and you're sort of half asleep and you think, I'll remember that. And within 2 seconds, it's gone. You think, oh, what was that? What was the kind of, can I recall? Oh, no, it's gone. No, it's gone.
And you can record it on your phone.
Well, yeah, I had to have the phone there and, you had to disturb the boy. And,
Voice
recorder, phone recorder. I just have to have a little, I have to be talking to my watch like Get Smart.
Maybe a texter, just write it on your arm. That's what my kids do.
One of these helpful suggestions on how not to lose a poem. My question is about the title of the whole collection, Uneven Verse. I'm interested in why Pam has called it Uneven Verse.
There's a poem, there's a couple of poems that pick up on the title. 85 says, my uneven offerings, simple-minded wear, nevertheless. This is also, complete in my imperfection, I fail again. Uneven has an ambiguous dual meaning. It can literally mean that the hem of your skirt's uneven, but it can be used as a criticism of art. Or her production is uneven. It's a bit of a euphemism for crap. Don't give up, but basically you're not doing well. It's an uneven production because there's some really terrible work there. My work was criticised as uneven by a critic once, and I was pretty cut by it. But as time went on, I realised that that within the Japanese aesthetic, unevenness is seen as a virtue. We collect Japanese ceramics, and we have one piece of tea ceremony, raku tea ceremony ceramic from Kyoto, which was given to us from Toshi's dad. It's the most rough, uneven looking, but I've got no idea what it's worth. I mean, it's just the most beautiful. It's black. It's in here, the black pottery here. That uneven. My favourite bowls are the ones that we got from the throw-out store at the front of the expensive pottery shop that have a little chip in them or aren't perfect, aren't good enough to sell in the shop. But even at the highest level, uneven is seen as being a virtue. The Japanese aesthetic can be defined as imperfect, impermanent. But and so I thought, my work is about the rhythm of life. It's not about perfection. I write every day, and it's like a wave, and sometimes the poems are great, sometimes they're not so great, but they form a unity of life. This is everyday life. This is standing at the kitchen sink. It's bringing the washing in and putting the plants out, Maybe that's not a brilliant poem, but that's just my day, and I don't think that should be edited out, and we should just have, it's not Instagram, it's not just the perfect ones, it's not just the most beautiful ones. This is everything. It's everything. So I just thought, well, great, I'll embrace that. I'll embrace that criticism. And it is uneven. It's uneven in a sense that every poem isn't a masterpiece, because all the masterpieces were forgotten, of course. So I forgot to write those down. But it's also uneven in that it's the reflection of the waxing and waning of your days. And you have good times and bad times, and ordinary poems and inspired poems, but they should all be included. You can't just pick out the best one or what. Well, I'm bad at judging my poems anyway. I have to have an editor to say, who's the editor anyway to tell me which ones are the best? So that's what I think comes together in that sense of being uneven, all those elements. It's 7:30.
Yes, it is 7:30, so
I just wondered, were there any other questions on the Zoom?
No, it looks like that was the
Wouldn't like
Zoom.
to ignore the Zoom
No.
people.
other Zoom people. I've certainly been a Zoom person
Yeah.
sometimes with an avid launch. So, plants out, washing in. I think that's quite perfect. I think this has been a pretty well perfect discussion. You might want to find a chip in it somewhere, but even if there is a chip, it will still be perfect.
There is a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in.
That's right. So, congratulations, Pam. The book is launched. Thank you, Adam.
I would say something very prosaic when they talk about the prices. Yeah, about $25 per book. If you want to buy Ash and Uneven Verse, that's the $40 deal.
Mhm.
If you want to buy both poetry
Each
books,
one. Okay,
yes.
perfect. Yeah.
Not 2 copies
Yeah.
of Uneven. Okay. Thank you.
All right, guys. So if you just want to stay seated just for one moment, and we'll bring Pam inside and get her at the signing table, and then